We'd like to thank GoDaddy, our sponsor for our podcast from Node.js Interactive in Austin, Texas. You may know GoDaddy as a hosting company, but they also have a deep involvement in the Node.js ecosystem. You can learn more at GoDaddy.com. That's GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams, the new stack here at Node.js Interactive. It's our first interview at the conference, and our topic for today in this first discussion is really about curation. And what is that, what does curation mean? It's the big question mark that we're hearing here at the conference just as it start. And I'm joined with me, Darryl Taft, a longtime industry veteran. Hey, Darryl.
Hey, Alex.
And James Snell of IBM. Hey, James.
Hey, how's it going?
And Brad Farias of GoDaddy. Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty good.
Great. So curation is this big question mark, but what maybe one of you guys could just tell us like how things compare to a year ago. What is it? What are we seeing today? In this space right now, which makes curation still a big question mark in itself.
So, Node.js, particularly over the past year, has just seen a tremendous amount of growth, right? Some of the numbers that we're talking about in the keynote this morning in terms of 100% growth year to year. We're seeing tremendous levels of downloads, tremendous numbers of new modules that are being published out to NPM. But one of the key challenges that we're seeing is that with all of these modules and all of this growth, it's really hard to kind of figure out where to start, right? How to make sense of it. Which modules should be used for which purposes, right? And that's kind of a big missing piece of the puzzle right now is a real clear guidance on, which modules are good, which ones are the best supported, which ones have the permissive licenses, right? Which ones are ones that I can really depend on if I'm building a business, right? And that's going to be a different set of modules than if you're doing IoT stuff or robotics. There's different use cases that have different requirements, right? And being able to pick out which of those pieces are ideal is something that's not really being handled very well right now.
I'd just like to add that we're not just talking about new things that you're using, not just finding new modules, but also just understanding what you're already using in your applications is becoming more important as we've got a lot more enterprises using Node, and they're becoming more concerned with what they have already deployed in the wild. Node now has this LTS schedule that we're adhering to, so better support over time means more curation of existing applications.
Darryl, any questions that you have?
So what are you both doing about it? I mean, are there projects or efforts within your companies to address this?
Yeah, right now it's really kind of trying to spend a lot of effort just getting our head around what the problem is, what the needs of the community are. And I've had countless conversations, just so far at this conference and the Node Interactive in Europe that was in September, and a few of the other ones where it was just, what are the requirements? What are the needs? What are the things that just aren't being addressed properly today? The announcement this morning about the Node security project coming into the foundation actually addresses a key part of that missing piece, because it starts to give us a central location for at least security data. What are the modules that have issues, right? What are the things that have been addressed? What are the things that still are outstanding? And having a central database of those vulnerabilities available and have that part of the community and community managed for everyone's benefit, not just any individual company. I think initiatives like that are going to be key in moving forward. At the same time, there's companies that are looking at the problem. IBM's looking at the problem. NodeSource announced some stuff this morning where they're obviously looking at the problem.
Right.
And if you look around, everybody recognizes that that's something that needs to happen. So I think everyone's just kind of figuring it out still, and kind of pinpointing what the requirements are.
Yeah, and GoDaddy actually bought me a seat at TC39 this year to help me work on the JavaScript standard side of things. And so what that's been about is the JavaScript standard has this new syntax and semantics for their version of modules, which is somewhat different from Node's version of modules. And so there's going to be an upcoming question about what modules work well in both systems and if there are any problems for that. And so me and James have actually been working together to basically outline the problems that we see and work with TC39 to fix those problems before we actually get to the point where Node has to implement this new module system.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about TC39. As I understand it, it's it's really I'm reading here from a story about it. The designator of the ECMA working group that defines the ECMA script language or JavaScript. Really, is more commonly known.
Yes, so ECMAScript is the official name for what is colloquially known as JavaScript. So JavaScript is actually the Mozilla implementation of ECMAScript. But generally, any implementation of ECMAScript, be it JScript from Microsoft or V8's JavaScript implementation, is just going to be called JavaScript. So TC39 manages the language. So in other environments, they combine the language and the standard library. So Java actually has many libraries you can use when you use any Java virtual machine. JavaScript takes a very different approach where they provide very minimal amounts of frameworking and library code to let you have the bare minimums and ship very small virtual machines instead. And then the users using modules are able to supply whatever needs to be added past that point.
Okay. So I was looking at the story, and actually you're mentioning it. It's a story in Hacker Noon, and one of the issues that comes up is this issue about modules, right? So tell us a little bit more about the modules issue specifically that you're working on as it relates to TC39, how that contrasts to how things have been done with Node.js.
Well, so the way that a module is defined in Node right now is that it's a very dynamic it's a dynamic object, right? So the shape of what that module is, so the functions that it exports, the objects that it exposes, the API, is defined after that bit of code is evaluated and executed, right? The difference between what's in Node there and what TC39 is defined is that TC39's idea of modules is that everything is basically defined in advance. It's a static definition of what symbols are being exported and what's when they're being imported, and that definition is determined before the code is evaluated, right? And that ends up being a very fundamental difference between the two models that makes them very difficult to reconcile with one another, especially if we take into consideration all of the modules that already exist on NPM that are based on the Node way of doing things. It's not something that we can just simply flip a switch and it just works, right?
To put some perspective in that, we're talking 300,000-ish public modules, and some of these have download counts in the millions a day.
Right.
So,
I just wanted to know, is there a roadmap or any kind of timeline for when you're targeting different milestones or solutions?
Within Node specifically, we have no formal roadmap, right? A lot of the things that happen in Node core is based on just what the individual contributors are working on, what they're passionate about, and what their whatever their individual agenda is for wanting to move things forward. With regards to modules specifically, that one's a bit more complicated because it's not just what Node wants to do, right? We're dependent on TC39 on the specs. We're also dependent on what the VM implementers, Google and Microsoft, what they're doing, and when they are going to provide Node with the APIs we need to be able to build on and actually implement this what we call ECMAScript module implementation, right? Until we have those APIs, there's not going to be a lot we can do in Node. So we're looking at maybe about a year before we'll even be able to have something that is, that we can reasonably put in front of users and say, this is, here's TC39 modules that you can use. So it's a long roadmap. Right? Yeah.
But does TC39 have its own internal roadmap?
So TC39 doesn't do things by a date roadmap, but they have a staging system. And so there's stages 0, which is just basically somebody's written something and says, I want to investigate it, to stage 4, which means it's shipping to all the VMs. So ECMAScript modules already shipped in a standard. They shipped in 2015's ECMAScript standard. We're now on the 2017 ECMAScript standard about to be released. But after research from Node about how we could implement ECMAScript modules, some changes were needed to the specs so that we could at all implement them and still be able to use that 300,000 module ecosystem that we have. The change that is needed is currently stage 0. You can go up to stage 2 in one meeting, and then it will be up one stage per meeting after that. So the quickest we could fully land the change, at least historically, we could, put this on the fast track somehow because it's an important change, would be 6 months out before it lands, and that would be next year's specification that it has. So things actually ship quite often before the specification lands, because once it's stage 4, it hasn't landed in the specification, but VMs are perfectly valid to implement it at that point.
How's this affecting the end user, and how do you, kind of retain that experience that the end user, demands?
So end users of Node right now are very used to Node's very specific idea of what a module is and what those APIs are, whether it's using a require and module.export. And there's very specific APIs that are used to define the shape of what a module is. TC39's approach, they took a completely different way of doing it, and they baked certain keywords like import and export into the language in a way that is fundamentally incompatible with what Node was doing.
Right.
So ultimately, when we do get an implementation, developers are going to have to make a choice that I'm going to create a Node-style module using a require, or I'm going to create a TC39 style module. Right. Now, part of our implementation discussion is how do we make those work seamlessly together? So if you're using one, you can still use modules written in another. That's a major part of the discussion. And we're dedicated to making sure that happens. But developers are still going to have to make a choice. Which module system am I going to write my code to target? Right? And that's going to have a significant impact on the ecosystem. Longer term, TC39 modules are likely going to be the direction things go, and likely the direction developers are going to want to look, because that's what browsers are going to be doing. If we have if we can do it the same way on the browser side and the server side, then that's the direction we want people to go. But that's going to be a long road, right? So there's going to be some transition pain. And it's our job, as far as Node Core developers, to make sure that transition pain is there's as little pain as possible.
Yes, and people already are using tools to compile the syntax that is new to ES modules, but they're compiling it to the Node modules, which have very different semantics from ES modules. So there may be some hiccups on the road if people are already trying to use the syntax. Those might be inevitable. That's part of what these changes to the specification are about, is seeing how minimal we can do it. And if we can not do it in any way, what is the best course of action?
So developers have this choice, as you're saying, right? And there needs to be, though, the ability to make that choice, but also be having it still have a common framework so it can work seamlessly.
Right.
That's must be the core of the debate.
Yeah. It really is. The NPM ecosystem is as critical to Node as Node core itself, right? I mean, you can't really separate the importance of the two. We cannot move to a new module system, even if it's, no matter if it's part of the standard, we cannot move to that new module system if it means sacrificing the modules that are already there, right? And we have to be able to preserve their use. I mean, it goes back to the curation stuff. It's like, we need to do a better job of figuring out which modules to use. We still have to make sure they're usable, no matter what, right? And prioritizing the backwards compatibility is key. And that's, I would argue that that's more important than actually conforming to the standard, right? We have to preserve that existing ecosystem. We have to preserve all of the investments that have already been made in the Node platform moving forward.
So I guess my last question, and then Darryl, let Darryl ask a concluding question for this discussion. What are the different debate factions, the different schools of thought about this common framework that's really needed to be able, so we can have this seamlessness that we're discussing?
They're pretty varied. We have several GitHub issue threads about this, more than 3,000 total comments on it. So we've seen pretty much every approach I can think of for the solutions to doing things. So let's split it up into sub-decisions first, and then we'll kind of go all about it. One of the things is, since there's this new syntax and new semantics, there's actually a new parser in JavaScript, which very few languages have two top-level parsers. So that means, given a source text, some file for JavaScript, you can parse it either as what's called a script, which is what has always existed prior to ES modules, and what's called a module. So determining which to use is actually non-trivial, especially since the standard can make a source text parse in both. So we need a way to determine that, and there are a few ways we could take. Currently, the main ones are something called unambiguous grammar, which means we change the specification so any given source text can only parse in one. So that removes the problem because we can parse it and see which mode it must be parsed in. The other is we use a new file extension, which is very controversial. So that's one of the main decision points. Two is, should they be able to talk to each other? Node's CTC, as James was pointing out, values NPM enough that we won't ship anything if you can't use existing modules. That's so many man hours, I don't even know. We must have backwards compatibility where new ES modules are able to use old Node modules, and new Node modules can use ES modules in the same way. The mechanics of that are also another topic,
Right.
which is Node's module system is synchronous. It's a blocking thing where, excuse me, if you call require, it will stop your program while it's loading up your dependencies. ES modules aren't necessarily synchronous, so the question becomes, since browsers are doing things asynchronously, should we match them and do things asynchronously? Or should we match the existing behavior of Node and do things synchronously? So those are probably the three big talking points.
Right. And it becomes a very non-trivial issue. The use cases that are driving development in a browser are fundamentally different than the use cases driving it on server side. And there are so many different use cases where Node is being used, whether it's IoT, server, large scale, small scale. It's very difficult for us to generalize that, this particular set of use cases are more important than these, right? So again, prioritizing the backwards compatibility, the default position is we're going to do what Node currently does. We need it to support that at the bare minimum.
At the bare minimum.
Right. And if we are going to implement TC39's idea of modules, then we need to do it with changes to the spec, because we cannot implement what was part of the 2015 version of the spec in a way that is provides a reasonable experience for existing Node developers. So.
Any last
Yeah,
thoughts?
just one thing. What do you think of the concept of certification or certifying modules, particularly for the enterprise user?
I think it is a critical piece of the curation story. There are so many modules out there, and it's absolutely fantastic to see the amount of development and innovation and code that's just being put out there in open source. But the truth of the matter is there are the code does exist in a broad spectrum of quality, right? Some modules are just out there because they're just experiments, right? Other ones are serious like enterprise projects that have an entire team of developers that are full-time dedicated to supporting those. Some of the modules are commercially licensed, and you can kind of catch yourself in a trap if you're not aware of that. Other ones are very permissively licensed. It's very difficult to navigate that space, particularly with the amount of growth that happens in that ecosystem. Not just the new modules, but how often existing modules are updated. That being able to have somebody that has some domain expertise, like maybe it's looking at the security vulnerabilities, right, or looking at licensing issues, someone that has that domain expertise to say, what, we looked at this and validated that this is good, right? Within IBM, we have a whole process where we can't use any open source until it's gone through this certification process, just internally. We look at the licensing, we look at the security, we look at how it's supported. And if that's something that we know that we need for ourselves, obviously it's something that we can recognize that other people are going to need also, right? And every conversation I've had about the module ecosystem is all centered on the need for curation and certification and somebody to say, this module is good. It's going to be well supported, and it's something that you can build your business app on, right? And that, personally, just speaking for myself, not speaking for IBM or anyone else, I think that is probably the most important missing piece of the ecosystem right now.
And I'd like to say this was kind of brought up in your points, but there's something to be said about consistency. Node's general approach to dependencies historically has been using symvar, which means your module could be updated somewhat transparently every time you reinstall it. There are differing approaches to this. This year we saw Yarn show up, which avoids doing that by locking in your dependency version whenever you install it the first time, and then you have to manually update it yourself every time after that. And we also saw some consistency changes to the NPM registry, where they've moved to a more immutable approach. So you can't have these weird unpublished problems that we saw in the past. So I think if we're going to talk about certification, we should also talk about consistency, because if you can't get the same consistent results, how can you certify something? So, and that falls into a whole slew of other things that I've been talking about at the conference. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. Darryl, thanks for joining us in this discussion. And James and Brad, appreciate your time.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
We'd like to thank GoDaddy, our sponsor for our podcast from Node.js Interactive in Austin, Texas. You may know GoDaddy as a hosting company, but they also have a deep involvement in the Node.js ecosystem. You can learn more at GoDaddy.com. That's GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com.